welcome back to American History 1 Review. Today we're going to be talking about Unit 4, which kind of stops where we ended, or starts where we ended with the end of the War of 1812, and it kind of starts with the era of good feelings, which followed the War of 1812, as we kind of talked about at the end of the Unit 3 review. So, we're sort of entering a new time period now in American history that's called antebellum. And antebellum, if you know any of your stems or root words, that means before, and then bell means war. So this is before any time before the Civil War started. So technically, you could go all the way back to the end of the American Revolution, and then all the way up to the firing on Fort Sumter, if you wanted to be really specific about this time period. But the dates are really not as important. It's more important to know about what happened in this time period. So during this time period, what you're going to see is the North and the South are still going to be a part of the same country, the United States, but they're going to grow more different in terms of their economy, in terms of their views on slavery, their culture, and even their religion. And so all of these differences that kind of pop up between the North and the South during the antebellum period is going to set the stage and lead to the start of the Civil War. And so later on in this unit and then in Unit 5 and 6, we'll talk more about those differences and how those differences will help cause the Civil War. But the antebellum period is what kind of you call the time period where all these differences between the North and the South start to come up. So that's called sectionalism. Whenever there's differences between the North and the South, right after the War of 1812, there's going to be a strong feeling of nationalism in the United States. There's still going to be that sectionalism or those differences between the North and the South, but this era of good feelings or a period of nationalism will help to cover up that sectionalism, and we'll talk about some specific instances of when that happened later on. But nationalism is whenever you feel very, very strongly about your country, you feel very, very patriotic. It goes one step further than just being patriotic about your country. This is when you are extremely proud of your country, and you will even make excuses for your country if your country does things that are sort of illegal or immoral. Because you're nationalistic, you will kind of make excuses for that. Now, something that's really important that goes along with nationalism is the expansion of the country's geography. And so, as you'll see with any nation in history, and it's true for the United States as well, whenever the nation becomes really nationalistic, they're also going to want to expand and get more land, and that's going to be true for the United States. And this picture here really shows that nationalism really well. It says we owe allegiance to no crown. So it's talking about how the United States is a new country. It's independent. It doesn't need any more help from Great Britain or anything like that. So that's a really good example of the nationalism that the country had. So kind of going along with that nationalism, to give it a more official title for that is specific to this time period, it's called the Era of Good Feelings. So this happens right after the War of 1812 is over, and you have to realize that after the War of 1812, the United States, in a very short period of time, had defeated Great Britain, a very, very powerful country, if not the most powerful country in the world, not once, but twice. And they were able to win their independence the first time and keep our independence the second time. So, whenever you're able to do something like that, it makes sense that your country is going to feel very, very proud of itself, that it's going to feel accomplished and feels like it's done something. And that was true during the era of good feelings. What you're going to see during the era of good feelings is that the country is going to be really bold. It's going to go through a lot of transformations and kind of rock the boat a little bit as far as the way things have been in the country prior to this. And it's going to do this because they're really motivated, they're very proud, they're very nationalistic, and they feel like they can do stuff like that in terms of the Industrial Revolution, which we'll get to in a little while. in terms of westward expansion, which we'll also get to in a little while. But all of that kind of falls under the umbrella of the era of good feelings. It's kind of the official name for it. And so, an example of that nationalism that we just talked about is the Hudson River School. So, the Hudson River School was up in New York. We talked about the Hudson River earlier during the American Revolution, whenever the British tried to use it to cut off the New England colonies. Well, around that same area that we just talked about, there's going to be a group of painters, and they're going to get together and go around the area, and they're gonna start to paint different landscapes of the region. And on face value, that might not seem very significant, but you have to remember that before this happened, these painters would mainly paint stuff about Europe. So they would paint a picture of the Alps over in Switzerland. Well, during this time period, they might start to paint pictures of the Appalachian Mountains. So they're starting to become more focused on America and the landscape in America and not these European landscapes. It shows that the United States is really starting to establish itself, establish its own identity. You can almost think of it whenever someone uh, grows up, turns 18, they're still going to be influenced by their parents, but once they leave kind of the watch of their parents, they start to establish their own identity, like the United States did after it left the British Empire. So Hudson River School really showed that nationalism. The United States is starting to feel, like it has its own identity. So another example of nationalism that you might not always think about is with the Supreme Court. So, this guy in the picture, John Marshall, he was a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And if you've had civics, the Chief Justice really has a lot of power on the Supreme Court. They hand down most of the rulings on the Supreme Court. And so John Marshall, whenever he is the Chief Justice, and he was Chief Justice for a really long time, he's a very important Chief Justice. What he did is whenever he would rule on different cases that came up before him, he would typically rule in favor of strengthening the power of the federal government. And so you may not think of that as nationalism, but it is an example of nationalism because you're starting to feel like your government is more capable of doing things that the people that are elected to government and appointed to government positions are able to make rulings that are good for the country. And if you strengthen the government, then the American government is going to have more power to do things like expanding westward and regulating the economy and stuff like that. And so, if you feel very patriotic and nationalistic about your country, then you're going to be okay for the most part if your federal government expands in power. Now, that might seem kind of ironic because the South, we just talked about, they were Democratic Republicans. They didn't like a strong federal government. And they still didn't really like this under John Marshall, but because nationalism still existed in the country, they really were not going to vocally protest it. Later on, before the Civil War, they will when this era of good feelings kind of goes away, but we'll get to that later. So now we're going to go through a couple of those Supreme Court cases that John Marshall handed down and showed how the federal government was able to expand its power. So the first one is McCulloch versus Maryland, and so this case, came up before John Marshall in 1819, and it happened because the state of Maryland tried to tax the Bank of the United States, and so. Whenever a state like the state of Maryland, and before I explain it any further, remember that Maryland uh, is considered a southern state. So Maryland did not like, for most people in Maryland, did not like the Bank of the United States. They didn't think it was a legal institution. So what the state of Maryland tried to do is tax the Bank of the United States. Well, what John Marshall is going to do when it gets to him before the Supreme Court is he's going to rule two things. He's going to rule one, that the Bank of the United States is legal because Congress has to have the power to issue taxes, and they can do that through the Bank of the United States. So he ruled that it is legal. And then another thing he ruled is that a state cannot tax the Bank of the United States, because he said that if you have the power to tax the Bank of the United States, you also have the power to kill the Bank of the United States. So if a lot of these southern states started to um, tax the Bank of the United States, then eventually the bank would run out of money and it no longer exist anymore. So John Marshall kind of prevented that from happening by ruling on this case. So the next example of nationalism through the Supreme Court that John Marshall did is Gibbons versus Ogden. So this happened up in New York. It was between New York and New Jersey. And what this case did is that it strengthened the power of the federal government yet again, but it's kind of different than with the McCulloch versus Maryland. So basically, New York and New Jersey were two states. They border each other and they're separated by a river. Well, as this cartoon kind of shows, they were arguing over who had the power to operate their steamships in the river and trade. And keep in mind that if they're able to trade, one state is going to have more power over the other, because whenever you're able to trade, you make more money. So basically, they were arguing over who was going to have more money. And so, what the federal government under John Marshall is going to do is intervene and say that that neither one of these states have power over the other, because ultimately it's the decision of the federal government to control interstate commerce. Now, it's probably the first time you've heard of interstate commerce, but it's going to be really important for the rest of this class and even into American history too when you start to talk about railroads. So, interstate commerce is really just trade that happens between two states. It's a trade that crosses over state lines. So you can think of it today whenever you see these 18 wheelers out on maybe I 77 or I 40. If they cross over the state line, then neither North Carolina or Virginia has power over it, because ultimately the federal government has power to control interstate trade or interstate commerce. So, another thing that's going to happen around this time period, we talked about how whenever a country is nationalistic, they're also going to want to expand. They want to get more territory. Well, it's true in this case as well. So, remember that Spain is going to be the country that has claimed Florida. They establish, I think it's right in here somewhere, St. Augustine, and it's a colony. It was the first one that was established by Spain. They still control it up to this point. Well, this guy here, he's Andrew Jackson. You might recognize him. He's really young, and he's going to be really important later on in this class. But what he's going to do, he's gonna march into Florida, and he's going to go against his orders. His orders was not to take Florida from the Spanish. His orders was to just go into Florida and capture any slaves that may have escaped to Florida, bring them back to the South. Ultimately, he's going to go against that. He's going to kill Native Americans. He's going to kill Spanish settlers. And ultimately, Spain is essentially going to give up Florida to the United States under this treaty. Sometimes you'll hear this called the Florida Purchase Treaty, uh, but it's also called the Adams-Onez Treaty. So this treaty will give Florida to the United States. So the details of how that happened are really not as important. What you need to know is that this is really a good example of nationalism, because the United States is expanding its territory, it's getting more land, and whenever you get some land in one area of the country, then you're going to want to expand elsewhere, and the where you're going to see that next is expanding to the west. So, kind of going along with being nationalistic is the Monroe Doctrine. So, whenever James Monroe became president, James Monroe, he kind of came up with this idea about foreign policy that kind of goes against George Washington's ideas. So remember that George Washington did not want the United States to really be involved in foreign affairs at all. Well, the Monroe Doctrine is going to go against that because it says that any European power cannot come into the Western Hemisphere, North or South America, and try to colonize in that area. That this area, the Western Hemisphere, is closed, it's only open to the United States. Well, that really does not go against neutrality because you're not directly provoking another country. But let's say that a country did want to come and take over or colonize part of North or South America. Well, the United States would really have two choices. You can either fight that country and go against Washington's neutrality, or you can ignore that country and let it happen, but then you'd be going against your own doctrine. So this is really the first step that the United States will take away from neutrality, and it's not that big of a deal now because the United States at this point is not directly engaging with another power or fighting another power, but later on it will. And this is kind of the first step away from Washington's version of neutrality. And you'll see the Monroe Doctrine used a lot throughout American History 1 and then when you take American History 2. You probably heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, John F. Kennedy will say that the Soviet Union cannot put missiles in Cuba because of the Monroe Doctrine. So, Soviet Union's a foreign power trying to come into the Americas, and so he says you can't do that because of the Monroe Doctrine. So, another good example of nationalism during the era of good feelings is the American system. So, the American system is really the first time you'll hear about this guy, Henry Clay. He's going to be very, very important. He's the most important person from American history that never became president, according to some people, and they're probably right. So, the first thing he's going to do is come up with the American system, and the American system is not really foreign policy based like the Monroe Doctrine was, it's more economic based. So, there's going to be three main parts to the American system. The first part, as you can see in the picture here, is to reestablish a second bank of the United States. So, the first bank of the United States, Alexander Hamilton had came up with. It had expired, and what Henry Clay wants to do is to bring that bank back to have more control by the federal government over the national economy, power to tax, and you could buy stock in the bank, stuff like that. Second part of the American plan by Henry Clay was to come up with a protective tariff. So I explained in the Unit 3 screencast how a protective tariff works. Essentially, what you're doing is increasing the price of a good or a product that's made in a foreign country over the price of that product that's made in America. So essentially, what you're doing is making it to where people are buying American made products, which will help American businesses over foreign businesses. So that's definitely an example of nationalism whenever you're promoting your American products over foreign made products, like here in this picture with the British cloth. The third part of the American system, which is on the next slide, so I won't get into too much detail about it, is called internal improvement. So basically, what Henry Clay is wanting to do is to establish some railroads, some roads, and stuff like that that can be used to transport goods across the country. And whenever you're able to do that, you can sell goods, which will help the economy more. So, speaking of internal improvements, so I tried to not get into too much detail and get ahead of myself. But internal improvements, you've probably heard of infrastructure. Well, that's really what an internal improvement is. It's any type of transportation that's been built that's going to help the national economy. So, in this picture here, these are types of canals and railroads that have been built, and you can see that most of them are in the north. That's going to be important later on for the Civil War. I won't get into detail about that now. But whenever you build a road or a canal or a railroad, what you're doing is opening up trade. So if there's a factory here along the coastline, then what that factory can do once it produces something is that it can put that product on a train and ship it out west. and sell it to people out west. So you're expanding how many people can buy your product. When you do that, you're helping your business out because your business will now make more money. It can grow and it can expand more. And especially with the protective tariff where it's already making more money. And so that's kind of part one of the internal improvement. What the other thing that improvements can do is to increase westward expansion. If there are now roads or railroads that are going out west, and maybe you live here in Pennsylvania, and there's a railroad here, then maybe you can move out to Ohio or Indiana now. If there wasn't one, it'd be a lot harder to do that. So it's helping with westward expansion too. So, another thing that's going to help with westward expansion is the steel plow and the mechanical reaper. So, whenever people would move out west, now I'm not talking at this point about the far west like California or Oregon or Washington. At this point, we're talking about the Midwest, so Indiana, Illinois, Iowa is where we're talking about now. And so, whenever people would move out west, they're not going to move out west if there's not anything there for them to do and make money off of. Well, really, the only thing at this point you can do in this area is farm. So, this area of the country is really known for grain farming, and that's because of the climate there. It's really good and conducive to farm. And what the steel plow and the mechanical reaper is going to do, it's going to allow for not only people to farm whenever they move out west, they can do it on a much larger scale. So instead of having a farm that's a few acres large, you're going to see farms that are a few hundred acres large. And they can do that because they're not having to physically go out in the fields and harvest any type of product. If you can see here, this mechanical reaper is doing that for them. And the steel plow, they can harvest, they can work their soil better, and can plant things better because of that. And if those two inventions hadn't been around yet or been invented, then it'd been a lot harder and people would not have moved out west as much. Another invention that will primarily affect the South, and going back to the steel plow and mechanical reaper for just a minute, when people are moving out into this area of the country, the Midwest, where a lot of the grain farming takes place, keep in mind that this is in the Northwest Territory. They cannot take slaves with them to do any type of farming out there, so they had to do it themselves, and the steel plow and mechanical reaper allowed them to do it themselves without having to rely on slaves. The cotton gin, on the other hand, is primarily going to be in the South. And so, if you remember back to Jamestown, I talked about how tobacco was primarily going to be the main uh, cash crop or agricultural product that was going to be grown. Well, now we're starting to transition into cotton. And so, what the cotton gin is going to do is you can put some cotton in the top of the machine, you can turn the crank here, and it's going to take the seeds out of the cotton faster, and you can get a lot more work done with the cotton gin. And so the guy that invented it is Eli Whitney. He thought that it would help with slavery if you because this machine now can take the cotton seeds out and you're not going to need slaves to do it. Well, before you can get the cotton in this machine, someone has to go out in the field and pick the cotton. And this machine is going to allow the seeds to be taken out faster, so you need more cotton to go in this machine than you would before it was invented. Well, the only way you can get more cotton to this machine is to increase the number of slaves you have to bring cotton to that machine. And so, because of the cotton gin, you're going to see slavery really explode across the South. You can see here you have a little bit of slavery in the Chesapeake area, a little bit down in South Carolina. Well, by the time of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln is elected president and the first Southern states start to secede from the Union, slavery is pretty much everywhere in the South. There's a lot more slaves, and you can trace it all back to the cotton gin because cotton gin uh, required more cotton, and the way you get more cotton harvested is to have more slaves. So, and the first industrial revolution, we're kind of switching gears now from the south back to the north. And you can see here, this map really shows that there's a lot more happening during the Industrial Revolution in the North than there is in the South. There's still a little bit, but most of it's in the North. So, what the first Industrial Revolution is, it's a time period whenever there's going to be a very big increase in the number of factories and the number of textile mills. And kind of going along with that is you're going to see a growth of cities and a growth of immigration and people wanting to come into the country to work in these factories. So, in the North, if you remember all the way back to the colonial period, there's not really much farming that can happen in the North. So, what they're going to do instead of farming is to work in factories. So, in this factory here, they might be making guns, they might be making clothing like they would in the textile mills. And, this is the way they base their economy because they can't farm. Well, if you are doing all of this, like in the South with cotton, you're going to need people to work in these factories and make these products. So they would encourage people to come to these factories, and these factories were typically in cities. And so you're going to see the growth of cities, but also you're going to have people that are going to come from foreign countries to work in these factories, and that's immigration. We'll get to that in a little while, but these people are mainly going to come from Germany and Ireland to work in these factories. They're going to be poor. The factory conditions are very, very bad. In fact, you could compare this to slavery almost because these people do get paid, but it's very, very low, a very, very low wage. They're sometimes called wage slaves. Their conditions are that bad. And so the South would sometimes justify their slavery by calling out the North and saying, well, you're doing pretty much the same thing. So, going back to the idea of an internal improvement, one of those things, along with roads and railroads, is canals. So, what a canal is really an artificial river. So, they would build the Erie Canal across the state of New York, and it would start here in Albany. Albany is the capital of New York. It's not New York City, like a lot of people think, but the Erie Canal is going to be constructed in New York. It's going to run across the entire state, and what it's going to do is connect the cities in eastern New York. And in eastern New York, a lot of it is city. In New York City, you have Albany and Troy. These are cities in New York, but out in western New York, it's a very rural area. In the Finger Lakes region of New York, especially, uh, there's not very many people that live out there. There is some farming that can take place in western New York. And so, what the Erie Canal is going to do is connect these farms in the west with the cities and the factories in the east. And so, the factories in the east, they can sell some of their products to western farmers in western New York by putting their products on the Erie Canal on a boat on the Erie Canal. What it's also going to do is help with western expansion. And so maybe there were people in the cities, they didn't like working in factories. Maybe they wanted to move to Western New York to start a farm. Well, they can now get on the Erie Canal, go down the Erie Canal to one of these cities and establish their own farm. So whenever there is now a method for people to move out west, you're going to see more and more people take advantage of that method. And so a lot of people are going to start to move to western New York a more, and it still is a more rural area of the state. So the market revolution is kind of facilitated by these internal improvements and the transportation revolution, which we'll talk about later. But the market revolution, what you're going to see is the development for really the first time in the history of the United States, the idea of a national economy. So, and it's also called interdependent. So, what interdependent means is that one area of the country relies on the other part of the country for their economy. So, I'll give you an example of that. We talked about the textile mills in the north. They're making clothing and different cloths and stuff like that. Well, that stuff is going to be made out of cotton. Well, the cotton is going to come from the southern states around where, like where we live in South Carolina, Virginia, and actually around where we live in North Carolina, cotton is not going to grow as well. And there's also not going to be as many slaves in North Carolina where we live. Uh, But anyway, the cotton is going to come from the south. They might put it on a road or a railroad or even a canal, and they're going to send it to the northern states. The northern states are going to take that cotton and they're going to turn it into a shirt or into a blanket or a pillow or something like that, and then they can sell that back to the south, or they can sell it overseas. They can make money off of it. But the south is going to be making money from the north because they're selling their cotton to the north. So that shows how, even though the North and the South eventually are not going to agree on slavery, uh, they really do rely on it. The North is going to ironically take the Southern cotton that is picked by slaves and then use that same cotton to make money off of it. And eventually, there's going to be people in the North that see that as hypocritical, and that's when the abolition movement becomes more powerful. What kind of goes along with the idea of um, the growth of factories and the growth of cities is urbanization, and so urbanization is just what you call the growth of cities. It's a more formal name for it, and so what you're going to see is that a factory is more often than not in a city. Well, whenever there's a factory in a city, that's a job opportunity for many people. So, what a lot of people are going to do is go live really close to their factory to the point to where they can just get up and walk to work and work in that factory. And so, whenever there's a lot of people that are pushed into one area, and I should mention that a lot of the people that are going to live in these cities are immigrants, your German immigrants and your Irish immigrants, because they're going to be the ones that are going to take a low wage job in factories because they're desperate, they're poor, they're wanting to start a new life in the United States. But anyway, back to the topic. Whenever these factories pop up, the cities will grow around those factories, and there's going to be a lot of people that live in those cities. And the problem with that is that you're going to have a lot of people living in one area, and that's going to lead to problems. You're going to have a lot of crime. If people are really close to each other, they're poor, they're really going to be irritable, and so they're going to take out their anger on each other. Uh, that's an example of crime. There's more later on, formal crime, the mafia will pop up in cities. Uh, Later on, uh, overcrowding is going to happen because there's so many people living in one city. You're going to see disease spread more easily because people are in such close quarters. You're also going to see sanitation issues pop up because in these cities you do not have modern day plumbing. There's no toilets that you can flush, and what you're going to see is that people, instead, because they can't flush their toilet, is that they're just going to throw their waste out in the street. And that picture is what you think it is. And these people, that's not very sanitary, obviously. And people put up with that. You can obviously imagine it's going to stink in the city. It's not going to be very healthy. People can catch disease very easily. So the cities at this point was not a good place to live. Uh, an example of the factories and living in cities that we just talked about is the Lowell Mill system. So what's going to happen? This happened in Massachusetts. So there's going to be a lot of female workers. They're going to be young workers. So before a woman would get married, they would oftentimes still be controlled, if not by her husband, but by the factory system. So they would take these single women, they were really young, they were typically in their late teens, early 20s, and what they're going to do is basically control these women almost as if they were slaves. They would have housing for these women outside of the factory. So the women would come home from the factory, they'd stay in this house, all of them would live together in this house or in this group of houses. There's people that would watch over them, and whenever it was time for their next shift in the factory, they'd go in, they'd wake them up, they would walk them down to the factory, and then they would work in the factory, repeat the process over again. They were not allowed to do very many things at all as far as recreation. They could not, go out, on the weekend or anything because more than likely they're going to be working, and when they're not working, the people that are watching over them are not going to allow them to do anything fun that might challenge their role. The only way a woman can get out of this system is if she got married. And whenever that, especially back in this time period, whenever a woman got married, she was expected to have children. She was expected to take care of the household and clean the house and cook and stuff like that, stay within the house. And so that is one way that a woman would get out of it. It's not that much better of a condition because in the end that woman is still going to be controlled, if not by the factory, by her husband. um, and eventually women are going to get fed up with this system and the system where they're staying in the household all the time, and there's going to be a women's rights movement that we'll talk about later on. um, Kind of going back now to the south, the factories were primarily in the north. Well, in the South, what you're going to see after tobacco is kind of phased out as the main cash crop is that cotton can also grow really well in the South. And so that's because of the fertile soil, the warm climate, the sunshine in the South. Uh, there's a lot of crops that can grow well in the South, but cotton is one of them. And it's going to grow so well in the South that their economy is going to be based almost solely on cotton. And whenever it's based solely on cotton, and you're going to have so much cotton, then you're going to need someone to pick that cotton. And what the Southerners would do is turn to slaves to pick the cotton. And the cotton and the slaves are going to become so inextricably linked together that this cotton kingdom is an idea, it's sort of a nickname for the South. And it just goes to show how important slavery and cotton was to the South. You can see here in this chart the darker red color, over 50% of that county's population is a slave population. So in many, many instances, the slaves would outnumber the whites in a county. And eventually, some slaves are going to realize that and try to rebel, but we'll talk about that later. But the slave population is going to be so high once more because of how much cotton is being grown in the South. And so, whenever you have a large number of slaves, a really big slave population that can rebel and has the numbers to rebel if they wanted to, what you are going to try to do is restrict that population of people as much as you can. Don't allow them to do anything that would make them question their status in society. And so, the slave codes are going to be developed to do that. So, what a slave code is, and over time, what you'll see is the slave codes will get stricter, but it's going to restrict the ability of slaves to do anything to better their condition. So, really, at the core of the slave codes is education. So, eventually, the slave codes are going to say that a slave cannot be taught to read, a slave cannot be taught to write. Well, why are they going to do that? Well, if a slave cannot read, a slave cannot write, if a slave is not educated, then they are not going to be able to question their condition. They're not going to be able to rebel. If you keep the slaves ignorant, and again, it's not their fault that they don't have an education, it's because of the slave codes. But if they're kept ignorant, then they're not going to question you. And that's what the white plantation owners and the white slave owners in the South wanted. They did not want the slaves to question their role in society. And so they also limited the ability of slaves to assemble because there are going to be some slaves that do have an education, and if you have an education, you're going to be more than likely to question your status in society. And so, if a few people are educated, then they can get everyone else together and kind of teach them about their status in society and get them to also question it. But if they're not allowed to assemble and be in large groups, then that really isn't possible. So overall, the slave codes limited the ability of slaves to question their role in society. And so that kind of brings us to sectionalism. So sectionalism, we've kind of talked about it before, but it's the idea that the North and the South are two different regions or two different sections of the country are going to grow so apart. They're going to have such different ideas that it eventually is going to cause tension between those two parts of the country. And so within the United States, sectionalism is going to be caused over in the end, slavery, there's going to be some other factors that will contribute to sectionalism, but the main one is slavery. The North is not going to tolerate slavery, especially later on as we get closer to the Civil War. At this point, the North, they don't really like slavery, but they're able to put up with it. Over time, that's not going to happen. The South is also going to become more rooted and tied to slavery because of the growth of cotton, the Cotton Kingdom idea that we just talked about. Over time, the North and the South will not compromise because of the sectionalism, and that will cause the Civil War. Some of the other factors in slavery that contributed to sectionalism is the vision for the country. The North, as you can kind of tell based off of the Industrial Revolution that we just talked about, they're going to want the economy to be based off of factories. They're going to want people to work in factories. They're going to want manufactured products to be made and sold. Well, the South is going to want the country to be based more on agriculture and the selling of agricultural products. So that's just another way they're different. The North is going to want the federal government to be stronger to regulate the economy and eventually to regulate slavery. Well, the South is not going to want that because they fear that if the federal government is stronger, then they can eventually come after the institution of slavery in the South. If the federal government is strong enough to regulate the economy, and your economy is so tied to slavery, well, eventually they can regulate slavery in the South, is what they feared. And so eventually the sectionalism during the era of good feelings is going to come up. But because the country is so nationalistic at this point and united, they're going to be willing to compromise at this point. They're not always going to be willing to compromise, but at this point they will. So in 1820, what's going to happen is Maine and Missouri are both going to want to come into the Union. Missouri is going to want to come into the Union as a slave state. Well, in the Senate, keep in mind that each state has two senators. And so before Missouri would come into the Union, the, the number of states in the South that had slaves and the number of states in the North that didn't have slaves was equal. So if in the House of Representatives, and remember, there's more people in the House of Representatives from the northern states because in the House of Representatives, the control is determined by population, and there's more people that live in the north, largely due to immigration, industrialization, and stuff like that. But the House of Representatives could pass, theoretically, a bill that would attack slavery. The Senate at this point could not because they were deadlocked. There was not a bigger number of people uh, from the North or the South, so it kind of it would be a net effect. There'd really be no difference because of that. Well, if Missouri came in, that they would come in as a slave state, and that would upset that balance. So what Henry Clay is going to do is say Missouri can come in as a slave state, Maine will come in as a free state, and that will keep the balance because you're adding one slave state, but you're also adding one free state. So the overall effect will be neutral. He's also going to draw a line here uh, at the bottom of Missouri, the 3630 line. He's going to say that any state north of that line, except for Missouri, cannot have slaves, but states that are south of that line can have slaves. But this only applies to the Louisiana Territory that I'm outlining with the mouse. Eventually, that's going to be a bad thing because this area of land over here is not the Louisiana Territory, and you have to decide what's going to happen there as far as slavery goes. Um, Sort of switching gears from that is there's going to be a presidential election in 1824. These three men here are going to run for president. The main two is going to be John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson here. John Quincy Adams is here. He's the son of of John Adams, the second president of the United States. He's from the North. Andrew Jackson is from the South. Um, but anyway, during the election of 1824, what's going to happen is Andrew Jackson is going to win the popular vote. So more people in the country vote for Andrew Jackson, but in the Electoral College, which is determined by that state's population. And keep in mind, the North had a larger population. Andrew Jackson did not win the electoral vote. In fact, no one won the majority of electoral votes. So, what happens then is that the House of Representatives is going to decide who becomes president. Well, what's going to happen is that there's going to be some kind of backroom, kind of shady, under the table deal where John Quincy Adams is going to become president if he appoints Henry Clay to his cabinet. Well, it just so happened that Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House. He determined kind of what happened in the House, who ultimately, if one of these two men was going to become president, it would have to go through Henry Clay. Well, Henry Clay lets John Quincy Adams become president, and then he gets appointed to John Quincy Adams' cabinet. Well, Andrew Jackson is obviously not going to like that. He's going to call it a corrupt bargain. He's going to say that he was cheated out of being president. He's going to grow very, very resentful over it. He's going to be angry, and eventually he will get his revenge, which we'll get to in just a minute. Now, around this time period, something we need to talk about, which will be important for Andrew Jackson, is the idea of universal white male suffrage. So, prior to this time period, the only people that were allowed to vote is typically if you were a wealthy white male landowner. So around this time period, though, more states are going to drop the property qualification to vote. And so they're going to allow people that don't own property, and keep in mind the people that don't own property are your poor people. Essentially, what's going to happen is that poor people can now vote if you are a white male that's poor. Now, women, obviously slaves, they're not going to be allowed to vote at this point, but poor white men can vote. And so you're starting to see the idea of expanding suffrage become more popular. Eventually, after the Civil War is fought, suffrage will be expanded to black men, and then in American history too, under the 19th Amendment, it will be expanded to women. But this starts the process of expanding suffrage to more groups of people. Now, the effect of this is that you're going to see more people vote. If you now have the right to vote and you haven't been able to vote prior to this, you're going to take advantage of that and you're going to go vote. So, more people are going to vote. But if more people are voting, then there's more campaigning that has to happen because people um, are now having to win your vote. If you come to a poor person and that poor person can now vote, you're going to have to campaign and tell that poor person why they should vote for you, or you're not going to win. And eventually that will lead to mudslinging, where candidates just kind of go at each other's throat trying to win the votes of these poor people that can now vote. And some of it gets very, very interesting. I'll tell you that the mudslinging does. And that kind of comes up in the election of 1828. Well, Andrew Jackson is going to run for president again. He feels like he was cheated out of being president the first time. So he's going to try to get his revenge in the next election, and he does. He will win the election of 1828. Not only did he win the popular vote, he now won the electoral vote. So the election did not go to the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson won, and he won fair and square. A big reason why he won is because of universal white male suffrage. Andrew Jackson was he was an interesting a president. He came from a poor background himself. He was a war hero, and so whenever he came from this background of not only fighting in the military but also being poor, and you have more poor people that can now vote, these poor people are going to vote for someone that they view as one of them. And so that helps Andrew Jackson win. And so once Andrew Jackson becomes president, you're going to see this era of the common man start to happen, where there's going to be more laws that are going to be passed that favor poor people, or the common people of the country, as they're sometimes called. More states are going to institute universal white male suffrage. There's going to be some more laws that are passed that favor the poor. As far as religion, there's going to be religions are going to start to become more people focused on the person itself and not really on doctrine. and you'll talk about that later on. But the election of 1828, Andrew Jackson wins, and he wins because of the poor people that can now vote for him. They view him as one of their own, so he's going to win that election. So that is the end of the Unit 4 review PowerPoint. Go ahead, use your notes, and take the Unit 4 review quiz.